A couple minutes behind. I'm Steve Bloddick from the law school and a senior fellow at the Strauss Center. It's an honor to be here today. My job today is actually to introduce the introducer, which is always a weirdly fickle task, so let me go quickly. The Brumley Fellows Program, which is behind today's event, is an awesome program. In case you don't know, it provides research training and mentorship opportunities to exceptional undergraduate and graduate students here at UT, involving students in international affairs early in their career, with an eye toward fostering both their professional development, interesting dialogues here on campus, and so on. And it's with that in mind that we have today's event. I'm going to introduce the Brumley Fellow I've been working with this year, Jake Beach, who's a third-year student at the law school from Grapevine, Texas, a summa cum laude graduate of Texas A&M, but we like him anyway. Jake worked for the Department of Defense and the White House before law school. He's the editor-in-chief of TRALP, the Texas Review of Law and Politics. He's going to be clerking for Judge Ed Kincaid in Dallas in the Northern District of Texas next year, and after that he's going to go work for Vincent Elkins. So Jake, why don't you come up here and introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Professor. It is my honor to now introduce Ms. Suzanne Spaulding, who currently serves as a senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Prior to her time at CSIS, Ms. Spaulding served as the Undersecretary for the National Protection and Programs Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security, where she was effectively the CEO with a rank equivalent to a 4-star general, managing a $3 billion budget and a workforce of 18,000, charged with strengthening cybersecurity and protecting the nation's critical infrastructure. Throughout her career, Ms. Spaulding has advised CEOs, boards, and government policymakers on how to manage complex security risks all across all industry sectors. At DHS, she led the development and implementation of national policies for infrastructure protection, including support for national security special events at stadiums and other public venues, and the development of the National Infrastructure Protection Plan. She also chaired the federal government's Aviation Cybersecurity Initiative to identify and address key cyber vulnerabilities in the national aviation system. She has worked with many foreign governments as well on critical infrastructure and cybersecurity, including negotiations with China and Israel. And she also led security regulation of the chemical industry, biometrics and identity management, emergency communications, and the Federal Protective Service. Needless to say, it is an honor to have her here joining us today. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Suzanne Spaulding.
Thank you very much, and thank you to UT and particularly to Professor Chesney and Bloddick for inviting me to be here. It's wonderful to be here in Austin, and great, selfishly, to have an opportunity to reconnect with two folks who I've known much longer than they or I would like to admit. Steve Bloddick and I were reminiscing fondly about our days together on a Guantanamo task force in 2007.
We had it totally solved.
Yes. Ça change plus le même, that's right. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And Bobby and I go way back, largely through the ABA Standing Committee on Law and National Security, I think back into the 1990s, yeah, where Bobby was one of the only people who listened to me and sort of and really got it when I was ranting and raving about the merging, the blurring of lines between Title 50 and Title 10, Title 18. What are we going to do? Yeah. I have watched the two of them, and you all are extremely fortunate, those students who have the opportunity to work with these guys, and all of you in the community who have the opportunity to interact with them, hear them, and listen to the National Security Law podcast, of which I'm a big fan. So, thrilled to be here. Thank you very much. I thought what I would do today is really talk with you about this project that I am leading at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a think tank in Washington, D.C. And I will tell you that we have just sent our big report to the printer. We're having an event next week on May 1st to roll it out. And so you're getting a sneak preview today, before anybody else, of kind of our findings and why we think it's really important to be sounding the alarm. about this. So I'm going to kind of walk through our findings and give you a little bit of background on how this project kind of came about, and then open it up for your comments as well as your questions and discussion. So, as you heard, I was the Undersecretary for what I am glad to say is now called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, a much better name than what we lived with for many years, the National Protection and Programs Directive. It's a horrible name, tells you nothing about what we do, but we were responsible for strengthening the security and the resilience of our nation's critical infrastructure against all hazards, cyber and physical, man-made and natural. And so, in 2016, we were focused like a laser beam on election infrastructure and protecting the security of our and resilience of our election infrastructure. And my team had done an analysis in 2015, or at the end of 2015, to say what do we mean by election infrastructure? What does that encompass? And that's really important in the context of the election security to really understand that, of course, it's much more than the voting machines that get so much attention. They are a really important part of that election infrastructure, but it starts with voters registering to vote and the process by which they do that, the storage of that voter registration information, the use of that voter registration information on election day, all the way through to all the things that happen on election day, including the tallying of votes, the reporting of votes up through from the precincts to the counties to the state Secretary of Elections, to the broadcast networks, reporting on election results and everything in between. And so we were focused on that entire spectrum. In early spring of 2016, March timeframe, we began to get indications. Let's see if I can do this right. Where do I come here? I just finished telling Allie that as a lawyer, I never used to use slides. The very first time that I talked about this project was almost a year ago now out at Stanford. And they had the slides all set and ready to go, and then when I got up to give the speech, they wouldn't work. But I was much less dependent on them. In any event, what we started seeing was cyber activity in voter registration databases around the country. And pretty quickly, what we understood was this was not about getting access to personally identifiable information. This was not about getting people's names and addresses, which are pretty easy to get hold of in other ways. As we thought about this and as we began to get indications that maybe this was Russia behind this, we thought, well, what would Russia's objective be in going after voter registration databases? And it did not take us long to figure out that it would be disruption as part of a disinformation campaign. Right? This was part of their information warfare. And this is an important insight into how Russia thinks about cyber. Mike Hayden, former intelligence community leader in a number of different roles, talks about how important decisions were made early on in the US and Russia about how to deal with cyber. Russia viewed cyber as just a tool in its broader strategic objectives, and really primarily a tool about information, controlling the information space. Whereas we, when in the technical sort of cybersecurity as I talk about it as a stovepipe, thinking about it as a technical issue. And that has had implications as we've gone through this. So, what could Russia do getting into voter registration databases? They could delete names. This has to do with the integrity, not the confidentiality of that data, but the integrity of that data. We think about cybersecurity, we think about confidentiality of data, integrity of data, and access to data. And that's always the way to think about consequences of cyber activity. I think of attacks on industrial control systems as being primarily about messing with the integrity of the communications to those systems that control mechanical devices. So in this case, we thought this has to do with the integrity of data, first and foremost. If you deleted a bunch of names from registration databases all across the country. If you change, just even change the spelling of names, or changed a little bit the address, and people are suddenly being turned away in large numbers on election day from being able to vote. Long lines are forming because that never happens quickly. Or people are being sent to the wrong precinct because their address has been changed, or the precinct that indication of where they're supposed to vote has been changed, right? Suddenly you've got a situation in which the American public now is likely to have questions about the credibility of the outcome, the legitimacy of the outcome of that election. And what we were starting to see in the hack and leak of emails from the DNC and the DCCC and John Podesta, again, a lot of that was going to this notion that the system is rigged, that the system is not legitimate, right? And so we saw this narrative emerging, also in various things online. And so that was really helpful in getting to the state and local folks to help them understand what we thought this activity was about, and helping them shore up their cybersecurity. So, long and short of it is we worked with state and local election officials. We had a controversy over designating them election infrastructure as critical infrastructure. I'm happy to talk about that if anybody in the room wants to raise that in the Q&A. But what I really want to do is then shift the focus. As you saw, the title of my remarks and the title of our report is Beyond the Ballot, How the Kremlin Works to Undermine the U.S. Justice System. So when I got out of DHS at noon on January 20th of 2017, I took with me not just the knowledge of what we had seen in the election, the use of cyber activity for disinformation and a broad-based online propaganda effort, but the understanding from the intelligence community, and this is reflected in their January report of 2017, that what we saw in the election was really just part of a broader, longer-term campaign by Russia to undermine our democracy and to weaken us. And so I brought together a couple roundtables of national security professionals, bipartisan group, to look at, what do we see about this? What do all of you think about this? Is this an accurate assessment? And I was quite concerned because as I was watching way too much cable news coverage, I was getting increasingly frustrated that people were only looking back. It's really important to understand with as much granularity as you can what happened in 2016. But then they would, if they were looking forward at all, they talked about Russia will be back in 2018. And we hear that today, right? They will be back in 2020, as if they just pack up all their stuff and leave and come back when it's election time. And I knew that they are here every single day, engaging in disinformation and propaganda efforts to weaken us, to undermine our democracy. And we needed, my sense was in early 2017, we need to be rallying, mobilizing right now to counter this very significant threat to our democracy. In a time of declining trust in democratic institutions, a time of declining support for the idea of democracy, a declining understanding of why it's important, why we value it, a growing sense of complacency about the inevitability of democracy, all of these inherent weaknesses. And this is what Putin does. Putin goes after and exploits weaknesses of our own making. Russia does not invent these narratives that it promotes, right? It latches on to divisiveness in this country and vulnerabilities and weaknesses of our own making. And Putin does this, I believe, for a number of reasons. I believe that Putin's most important audience is his own population. He's seen the fall of the Soviet Union, the color revolutions, the Arab Spring. The idea of a population longing for Western-style democracy is extremely threatening to him. Unlike China, he knows he does not have a sort of shining example or model. The Russian model is not one that he's really going to successfully export around the world. So his own population, to convince them that, hey, democracy is not all it's cracked up to be. They're just as corrupt and hypocritical as our system is, so don't long for that system. Around the world, to say, look, it's chaotic, it's messy, you don't want to buy into this Western liberal democracy idea. If you know that that's his objective, is to undermine, and then our population, obviously, very important, to get us to give up on our institutions, to become so frustrated, to become so cynical, so skeptical about the ability of our system to right itself, to be held accountable, that we stop trying to hold it accountable. We become apathetic, we check out. One of the biggest hashtags they pushed in the midterms was hashtag walk away. So I did a little red teaming. I thought to myself, okay, if I were Putin, and that's my goal, that's really what he's about, where would I go next? What other institution, what other democratic institution is as dependent as elections are on public trust in the credibility and legitimacy of its outcome to have any meaning in our democracy? And as a lawyer, I immediately thought of the justice system, right? If the public doesn't accept the decisions of the courts, if our leaders in government don't accept the decisions of the courts, and the public doesn't insist that they abide by those decisions of the courts, you can imagine the unraveling of our democracy pretty quickly. So I thought, for once we're going to get out ahead of something. No, I haven't heard anything about Russia going after the justice system. I haven't seen anything about it, but it makes sense to me that that's where I would go if I were Putin. So maybe if we get out ahead of this, we can. And as I started doing the research, John Hamry asked me to come to CSIS to do this work. I realized we were not getting out ahead, that it was already out there. So I start the story with the Lisa case. I start this story in January of 2016. This is in Berlin, Germany. And some of you may, as I talk about this, may vaguely remember this story. There's a young 16-year-old girl of Russian heritage in Berlin, Germany, who claimed that she'd been abducted and raped by immigrants. And she very quickly, under questioning from the authorities, finally admitted that, no, she'd spent the night with a friend. She'd made up the story because she was afraid to tell her parents that she'd spent the night with a friend. So they said, okay, no case, no crime, no case. Russian TV outlets started picking up on this story, the original allegations, right? And ran with this story that this horrible crime had been committed against this young girl named Lisa, and the German authorities were doing nothing about it. The prosecutor, the courts, the justice system completely failing on this. Social media picks this up, including Russian trolls, amplifying and pushing this story that the justice system in Germany was just a tool of the politicians and covering up for their soft on immigration policies and failing to go after and prosecute this horrible crime against this young girl. They managed to turn out over 1,000 people in rallies and protests all across Germany, protesting against the failure of the justice system to go after this, and that they were simply a tool of the politicians. So I'm going to come back to this because 6 months later, we find ourselves in Twin Falls, Idaho. But we're not there yet. I'm not sure I've said that. Here we go. I tell this story, and part of the Lisa case is also Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, himself, accusing German authorities of sweeping this under the rug, right, because of their political objectives. So what we have seen, and this is a consistent pattern throughout, is that Russia makes use of 3 primary channels for spreading its propaganda messages. They use state-run media outlets, they use social media, and they use official statements from senior Russian officials. All of these channels work together, they reinforce each other. In the Lisa case, it started with first Russia TV, it was then picked up by other Russian outlets, it was then picked up by social media, rebroadcasting and amplifying and pushing this message, and then of course we had the comments from Lavrov giving this really official weight. It's very difficult to sort of measure impact of these things because like RT and Sputnik, which are the primary media outlets that we worry about, don't have that big a viewership in the United States. But they are picked up in very big numbers. Their stories are picked up by domestic outlets, particularly InfoWars and Breitbart, right? But others as well. and pushed, and they are picked up by social media folks online, both left trolls and right trolls, and we'll get into this too. Russia, typically doesn't choose sides. It's pretty clear from the intelligence community and the Mueller investigation that in the 2016 election, they definitely chose sides in that election. But when they're just trying to pursue this running down of democratic institutions and democracy and build up emotion, they're perfectly willing and often do play on both sides. The third point here that the people who click on these propaganda messages, particularly online, get quickly pulled into this vortex, because the more you click, when you click on their story, the algorithms of these platforms then send you more. They think you like that, they send you more stories like that. And the more you click on them, the more and more you become inundated with that messaging. And so there's the secondary reach of people amplifying, and then there's the reinforcement that gets stronger and stronger. So I'm going to start with the state-run media outlets. And RT and Sputnik, in their general news, love to take opportunities to portray American democracy, and American institutions in a bad light. That's really what they do, under the guise of bringing you stories that no one else will tell you, right? These are really just the bearers of the real truth. They're doing it to make us better. Putin wants us to reform and be stronger and better. I think not. So one of my favorite programs is America's Lawyer on RT every week, hosted by Pensacola trial attorney Mike Papantonio. He's on their website, he's got his law firm's URL prominently displayed at the bottom. But this is typical of the message that he is promoting on his program. To say that the justice system in the United States is broken would be a gross understatement. Corporations and corrupt politicians have taken control, turning the once impartial judiciary into a tool for the elite to use for their own gain. And this is an ad that they ran, that they put up in Washington, D.C. on a bus stop. And this is typically what RT does. They will have American hosts. Larry King is a host on RT. They have a number of programs that have American hosts. And so this is Mike Papantonio, and the subplot, is this American enough for you? Right? This was after we required that Russia Today, which is what RT stands for, register as a foreign agent, because they are a propaganda outlet for the Russian government, not an independent media outlet. And so this is every week pushing this narrative that our justice system is in the hands of corrupt corporations, and it's just a tool for corrupt corporations and corrupt politicians. The overarching theme here is the justice system is not independent or impartial, and they tell that story in a number of ways. The other main outlet is Sputnik. Nope, that's that. Let's click on next. Sorry. So this is Sputnik. They have a weekly program, Criminal Injustice, and again, their sort of byline is every week the hosts discuss, quote, the most egregious conduct of our courts and prosecutors, and how justice is denied to so many people in this country. So there's plenty of ammunition for America's Lawyer and for Criminal Injustice, right? There are, again, lots of flaws in our justice system, and lots of criticisms that are very legitimate. And as I say to my friends who are judicial reform advocates, their work is so critically important. But their objective is very different, right? They really are about trying to bring about reform and to strengthen us and hold our institutions accountable to living up to our aspirations. That is not what these guys are about. So it's really very pernicious. They seize on some legitimate grievances, kernel of truth. They present a completely one-sided perspective on the system. Social media, so that's state-run outlets. Social media is where that's got most of the attention, right? Most of the talk about disinformation, Russian interference has been around what they're doing on social media. The indictments highlighted the group at the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia, that has been most responsible for creating, in the early days, now primarily amplifying domestically created material and voices and narratives. Project Lakta is the name of the core group that is responsible for these narratives and for spreading this narrative. The Justice Department criminal complaint that was filed last fall talks about their goal to spread distrust toward the political system in general, and we have been a primary target since 2015. The narrative frames that I've touched on already, and these are really pushed through social media, but really show up in all three of the channels, in the state-run propaganda outlets and in official statements as well. And these are the frames that they really are pushing. They use these divisive issues. As we know, they're weighing in on stoking fanning the flames of division that engulfs social media already around immigration and engulf our society. So they know immigration is a divisive issue in our country, and so they are weighing in across the board on immigration-related issues. But where we see them is where they bump up against the justice system. And they use the division around the justice system, around the immigration, to undermine confidence in the impartiality and independence of the justice system and its effectiveness in keeping Americans safe, right? So that the courts are all about covering up, just as you heard in Berlin and Germany, right? Covering up crimes by immigrants and issues around the controversy over immigrants. The second one is around racism and racial injustice. Obviously, another issue. Russia has, for many, many years, for decades, loved to push the story about America being a racist country. It's an issue that they have a lot of experience exploiting and really amplifying. And again, an issue where there are very legitimate grievances and complaints and concerns. And so, a pretty ripe target for them to exploit, to try to undermine confidence in our institutions. And so we see this in the context of sort of the police state, right? And law and issues around law enforcement, particularly. And then that the courts enable corporate corruption, which you saw some of in that quote from America's Lawyer. And finally, a big one, which is that our justice system isn't independent and impartial. It is a tool of the political elite, the deep state. So I promised you we'd come back to Twin Falls, Idaho. So the Berlin story happened in January of 2016. Fast forward to the summer of 2016 in Twin Falls, Idaho. We were just talking about the disinformation campaign that looks like it's going on in Racine? Champaign, Illinois, on campus. When I first saw the reports much later after these events that Russia tried to organize a rally in Twin Falls, Idaho, I thought, Twin Falls, Idaho, of all places. But what happened in Twin Falls, Idaho was that there was a sexual encounter involving three young kids in the basement of an apartment complex. The story that got out, which was incorrect, was that a 5-year-old girl had been raped by Syrian refugees at knife point and were later seen high-fiving their dads. Pretty explosive, emotionally charged allegations, none of which are true. There were no Syrian refugees, there was no rape of this 5-year-old girl, there was no knife point, there was no high-fiving their dads. The authorities had gotten reports of these three young people in the basement of the apartment building, something untoward and, not good happened there with this 5-year-old girl. But the authorities were right on it. They took the boys into custody. They were working it through the system. But as you may know, when you have juveniles going through the criminal justice system, there are real constraints on what the officials involved can say, the details that they can provide. because we try to protect the privacy of individuals who are not yet convicted, who are going through our criminal justice system. So, social media grabs hold of these false allegations, pushes them widely, and lo and behold, a group pops up called Secured Borders. Well, first we see some of the tweets online. These are Russian trolls, again, posing as Americans and as American groups. Wendy Olson, the federal prosecutor, was one of the people who tried to say to folks, stop retweeting these things. You're spreading false information. It's not true. The police chief got up in a town hall meeting and said, none of these facts are true. None of this is true. And we're working this through the system in the appropriate way, et cetera. But the stories took on a life of their own. She was then attacked. Wendy Olson, the federal prosecutor, was attacked again. All of them being accused of being the prosecutor, the judge in the case, the federal prosecutor, of all being tools of the political elite. That the politicians in Idaho Falls were soft on immigration. They were covering up crimes by these Syrian refugees because they didn't want people to be upset about their policies of bringing in all these Syrian refugees into Twin Falls, Idaho. In fact, Twin Falls, Idaho has not brought in any Syrian refugees. But in any event, this took on a life of its own. Secured Borders sends around an invitation to a rally. Some of you who have pored over the Mueller report with your yellow highlighters might have come across a reference to Secured Borders. Secured Borders is not a group of concerned Idaho citizens. It is a made-up group out of St. Petersburg, Russia, and so again, they're trying to do what they did in Germany. And the message that went along with this invitation to the rally was basically all government officials who are covering up for these criminals should be fired. They're putting refugees before citizens, etc. The criminal justice system is failed and is broken. And Secured Borders pops up periodically in a number of other contexts. They ultimately, social media put up a picture of the judge with a big arrow. Corrupt judge posted his home address and phone number. He got lots of threatening calls. It was incredibly disruptive and divisive in this little town of Twin Falls. So we see this again and again in cases, particularly again involving immigrants. So you may remember the Kate Stanley case. She was the young woman who was shot on the pier in San Francisco near Embarcadero. An undocumented immigrant was charged with, killing her. He was holding the gun. The jury ultimately found that it was an accidental shooting, and social media erupted with Russia in there in a big way, amplifying. This is from Hamilton 68, a dashboard that for a long time was tracking about 600 Russian-affiliated social media accounts and showing us what was trending. You probably can't read it, but this top line that is sort of off the charts is Kate Steinle, hashtag Kate Steinle. That's the Russians pushing this story that this is a failure of the justice system. Here again are a couple of the trolls posing as American groups. Our justice system has failed us many times and it's still broken. Failure of the justice system. Like before, when cops who murdered black people get acquitted, we see the overlap of these issues. A more recent case involving Molly Tibbets in Iowa, the woman who was jogging and was murdered, and again, an undocumented alien was picked up and charged with her murder. And when that news broke, Molly Tibbets, there are several Molly Tibbets lines on here, but you can see that again, the Russian trolls are weighing in a big way to use this to undermine public confidence in the justice system. Racial justice is the other area that I talked about, where we see them weighing in and using it to reduce trust in the justice system. You may recall the Alton Sterling case. This was again in the summer of 2016, and an African American who was shot and killed by a policeman in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And within 24 hours, the left trolls were amplifying the hashtag Hashtag Alton Sterling, right? Stoking these flames with very emotionally laden Twitter activity. This one, for one guilty cop, we've got 2 murdered cops who walk free. That's not how justice should work. With a headline from a made-up IRA group called Black Matters US, which was very active. Officers won't be charged in fatal shooting of Alton Sterling, right? So again, justice system is irretrievably broken. You'll never get justice from this. But it's not enough to weigh in on one side of the issue, right? If you really want to stoke division and you want to increase the heat and the anger that leads to, giving up on our institutions, you really want to stoke the flames. You want to weigh in on both sides. So Heart of Texas, which was again a right-wing troll from St. Petersburg, weighed in, of course, when a couple days later, Mika Johnson fired on police officers in Dallas, Texas, killing 5 police officers. And their Facebook page sponsored an event, Blue Lives Matter. Putin particularly targets minorities. And we did a commentary in December of 2018, really doing a deep dive on how and why Putin targets minorities. One of the things that they love to do is to either establish an affinity group or more likely go into an affinity group, groups that mobilize around grievances particularly, and that's why minorities are a particular target for Russia. And they come in innocently enough, and particularly with some of these affinity groups, they'll come in very innocently, sharing recipes, pictures of their cats, whatever. But bit by bit, they then start to weave in more political and divisive things. Or they come into a group around a grievance already, and they just stoke the flames. And really what they try to do is to build that sense of identity around the grievance, to make that sense of identity much stronger than your sense of national identity. So when the Russian General Jeremasov talks about going after breaking the internal coherence of the enemy, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about undermining our sense of shared values and getting us to be more interested in going after each other and at each other's throats than in standing up together against a common enemy, for example. Standing up together to solve our challenges and our problems. So they love going after. These are examples of the ways in which they've gone into Muslim groups. This United Muslims of America, again, sort of a fake affinity group that they've established, where they go in and try to bring people in, and they start with the soft stuff, and then they turn to much more heated rhetoric. Another theme that we see playing out in all 3 propaganda channels is this idea of the surveillance state. Right? And this is part of the idea that the tools of our institutions are all tools of our politicians. And Bobby and I have talked about this. I'm particularly concerned about this one because we have FISA debates coming up. You may be surprised that we have FISA. It doesn't feel like we just went through a whole big debate, right? We just did the reauthorization of the big part of FISA 702, but now we've got the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, some other key provisions that are coming up that are sunsetting at the end of this year. So we're getting ready to go into another debate, and I will walk through some of this rhetoric with you. My concern is that this is really shifting the political ground for this debate, and natural supporters of what is an important national security tool that needs to have important civil liberties safeguards and the trust and confidence of the Americans, where we need to have a careful, nuanced, sophisticated discussion and debate, is going to be completely polarized and again, much more heat than light, and spurred on by Russian interference, which is just stirring the pot and stoking, again, issues that if they went away tomorrow, these issues would still be here. But they are making it worse, and they're doing it very deliberately. So this is Putin's comments on surveillance. This was, interestingly enough, in an interview with Snowden. And Snowden asked him, or it was an event he was doing, and Snowden was there. Anyway, Snowden asked him, basically, doesn't Russia have the same massive surveillance that the NSA does? And Putin, in his answer, of course, is trying to, not only being disingenuous, but in a kind of backhanded way, accuse America of having this massive surveillance state that is not under the rule of law. You know, somehow they are more committed to the rule of law than we are, that we are really just, again, using these massive powers against all Americans, ignoring the rule of law. We have seen them weigh in more specifically on FISA, and this is a chart of hashtag release the memo mentions, and Russia, their social media accounts really sort of weighed in heavily at this point when the hashtag release the memo was just starting to take off, and used their very significant infrastructure online to amplify and really push. This was, release the memo, you may recall, was around the memo that was written for the House of Representatives around the Carter Page FISA surveillance of a member of the Trump orbit, I guess, at one time Trump campaign, Carter Page. And the allegations were that the FISA authorities had been abused and used improperly. And so, you know, there was this whole campaign about release the memo because it will show you how FISA is just a tool of the political elite. It's being used by the deep state, burrowed in, you know, again, undermining public trust and confidence that the system we had set up was independent, impartial, and under the rule of law. They went after Mueller. Again, they go after prosecutors as well as judges. These are instructions given to the Russian trolls specifically to amplify this messaging that Mueller is a puppet of the establishment. And there will be no honest and open results from the investigation. We see subframes there around, they're pushing hashtag Russiagate, that it was all a big hoax. We saw some very interesting activity around using the discovery process to try to make Mueller look incompetent. Big push to undermine public trust in the credibility of the Mueller report. And then, of course, we have Putin's response, official statements. Sheer nonsense, you know, never expected this aspect of the justice system to work. In September of 2017, this was one of the first things that caught my attention when I started looking at this. And when I was asking myself, is there really a Russian intent to undermine public trust in the justice system? Putin's quote, when we seized the 3 additional diplomatic facilities in September of 2017, that this was a violation of Russia's property rights, an outrage, and that he was going to ask his representative in the U.S. to sue in U.S. courts. And his next sentence, mockingly delivered, then we'll see how effectively the much lauded American justice system works. So as we look forward, you know, we need to be thinking about that this is, you know, again, I started looking at the justice system and it just, you know, emerges as you look at all this activity through that lens, that yes, their activities have the very grave risk of undermining public trust and confidence in our justice system at a very dangerous time when we are looking to the courts to resolve potential constitutional clashes between Congress and the President. You're reading the paper. And having trust and confidence in those courts and those outcomes, whether you like them or you don't. And being willing to accept decisions of the courts, even if you think they're political, right? But not getting to the point where you are so mistrustful of these institutions that you will not give them credibility and legitimacy or respect or honor those decisions. That's where they really want us to go. And Russia is, you know, what we have focused on because they've been most active. But other countries have interests also in spreading this idea that our courts are not independent and impartial. When we start arresting, or not we, our allies, Canada, arrests a Huawei executive, right? China is very willing to sort of get the word out that this is all just political. This is not abiding by the rule of law. Iran pushes those and is engaged in disinformation generally. Interesting stories in the last couple of days about Saudi Arabia pushing the whole Russiagate hoax propaganda as well. folks in Saudi Arabia, not yet clearly linked to the government, but hard to imagine, like in Russia, that much goes on without the Saudi government's knowledge, but we can talk about that. If you got questions, I have some theories. But we don't know what that's quite about, but Saudi Arabia certainly has been engaged in disinformation around Yemen, et cetera. And of course Venezuela, and Russia's involved there too. Every day at RT there's a story about how we're getting ready to invade. So, I talked about the roundtables that I brought together. We produced a report in February of 2018. These were our recommendations. We really need to get the word out. We need to publicize. We need to make the American public much more aware of the extent of adversary interference. We need to continue to research and come up with ways to counter the things that are most effective that the adversary is doing. So that's an impact analysis that really needs to happen. We need to improve the transparency into the specific activities, and particularly online. I think transparency is a really important way to help the American public be more discerning consumers of information. Not everyone will care, I get that, but a lot of people do. We need bipartisan action. We need a national strategy to deter this activity, to prevent it from taking place. And as critically important here, and one that we're taking on, among others, is to restore Americans' understanding of how important democracy is, why it is worth protecting, how the ways in which it is robust, but the ways in which it is fragile. And that we have an obligation, not just to sit back and be critical of our democratic institutions, but to help to protect and preserve them, and hold them accountable. Right? So that's a renewal of civics education, which has just been given short shrift so much of this country, and restoring a sense of shared values, what it is that we have in common, what is important to us, what does it mean to have an independent and impartial judiciary. There was a focus group put together that to talk about independent and impartial judiciary. After a while they said, we'd like you to stop talking about an independent judiciary. We don't like that idea. Conjures up this idea of a runaway court. I thought that was very interesting and very telling. We need to have sophisticated conversations in this country about what do we mean when we talk about independent and impartial courts, and why is that so important, and what are the mechanisms in place to try to preserve that, despite a highly politicized process for nominating and confirming federal judges, and despite having elections for state judges all across the country, right? So those were generally with respect to foreign interference and propaganda and disinformation. Specific recommendations that we're pursuing in the justice system context is to train judges and court officials. We're also trying to establish a justice defense corps. Doesn't that sound cool? A group of retired judges, former prosecutors, and lawyers all across the country in communities who are trained to detect and do battle online, to detect disinformation, and to help educate their communities about what's going on in the justice system. And again, expand civics and media literacy trainings. What we are bringing to that conversation is the reminder to people that civics education and engagement is not just nice to have, it is a national security imperative. As a national security think tank, which is what CSIS is, we are uniquely positioned to bring that, to put wind in the sails of those who have been laboring in the trenches for years to reinvigorate civics education. I could just roll the wheel, she finds out on the very last slide. Okay. So this is how you find the reports that I've referenced and some other things about our project. Just go to csis.org. Under the programs, look for the Defending Democratic Institutions.
The floor is open.
Yes.
Thank you, very interesting. And very much appreciate what the comments you've had. A couple questions that you probably can answer, but nonetheless, would love to hear your answer or opinion. Does Congress get it?
That is a good question. Some members of Congress get it. My friend Mark Warner, and I think his ranking member Burr, they've done, I think, a pretty good job so far being bipartisan in their investigation. And through the course of that investigation, they have come to understand that this is broader than just elections. And I think there are some other members, but frankly, they're not tech savvy, so they don't get the sort of really the impact of the online activity. And most of them, like most of the American public, are still focused like a laser beam on elections. And they can't really look beyond.
Because it seems to me that what's going on now is what the Russians want the Democrats and Republicans to do, and we're just carrying on their war.
Yeah. And one of the things that I say...
We're not doing anything that's on an offensive side. It's nice to do this defensive stuff, but you can't win a game just playing defense.
Yeah. Well, again, I think the intelligence committees are working with the intelligence community to look at what they, you saw the reports in the press about some offensive activity that reportedly took place around the midterms. The public reports that they shut down the internet access for the Internet Research Agency so that they couldn't push out all the stuff they wanted to in the immediate run-up to the midterms, that they tracked down, got to the individuals, some of the individual trolls who were putting out misinformation, and actually to their computers to be able to communicate with them directly to say, hey, we see you, cut it out, we're on to you. You can debate about how effective those things are, certainly over the long term. Again, I will say, candidly, I'm very concerned about the reports in the last few days that the Secretary of Homeland Security was not able to get the White House to pay attention to Russian interference and to lead a whole of nation, certainly a whole of government process for development of a strategy. As I said, it was very obvious to all of us from the outside, certainly, and I think to many people on the inside, very early on, that we needed the interagency to come together. And when I was in the administration, in the last administration, we had numerous White House meetings, White House-led meetings about Russian interference. When we have big issues like this, there's a standard process. You have an interagency team at the Assistant Secretary level that comes together, everybody brings all their resources and insights to the table, capabilities. Here's what we all collectively think the problem is, here's what we think needs to be done, and here's what each of us can do about it. Here are some tough decisions that need to be made by people above our ranks. Those go up to the Deputies Committee, which is the Deputy Secretaries of all of the Cabinet Departments, and ultimately, if need be, up to the Principals Committee for blessing, and then everybody has the marching orders, and we have a strategy and a plan. None of that's happening. Yeah? With respect to the platforms, we're starting to have those conversations in a more serious way now. But as you know, the platforms understand this. I mean, transparency is one of the things that they're looking for. As I said to a group that I met with at lunch, I feel quite passionately about the power of transparency. I told the group my next book is going to be called Training to Fight in the Light. The premise is that a transparent world is coming at us full steam ahead. The shelf life of secrets is vanishingly short. Your ability to have a monopoly on information is vanishing. And whoever figures out how to operate in that transparent world, operating with fewer secrets, right? With the idea that you're not going to have a monopoly on this information, that you're not going to be able to keep information from people, is going to have the advantage. And who is better prepared to train and operate in a transparent world? Us or our four key adversaries, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Okay? So what Russia is trying to do here is to exercise jujitsu. They're trying to use our strength, freedom of speech, open marketplace of ideas, even robust discourse online, which can be a really healthy thing, can be in a democracy. They are trying to use that strength against us and trying to get us, I think, to contract on free speech, to reduce that source of our strength. And we will make a big mistake if we play on their grounds. Instead, we need to play on the ground that we're strongest on, right? Use transparency. So train to fight in the light. If you train to fight in the dark, you could meet your adversary at night or turn out the light, and you'd have the advantage. We need to continue to train to fight in the light. Then we flip on lights all over the place, and we have the advantage, right? So flip on the lights online. And the platforms are starting to do this. They're finding ways to make sure that Russia Today stuff that is picked up and retweeted, that the Russia Today logo and identification goes with it. So that when you're looking at something, you at least know this is coming to you from your friends, the Russians. And if you don't care, you don't care. But if you do care, you should be able to know, right? They are taking down inauthentic activity, whether it's automated activity, the bots, or it is people posing as someone they're not. Our freedom of speech doesn't mean we have to allow inauthentic activity online, and they're taking that stuff down as they find it. And they're trying to get better at that, and they're developing tools and capabilities to get better at that. And flagging things, demoting. Google is trying to work with its algorithms so that stuff that is sketchy, that may not be stuff that is suitable for takedowns, is at least moved down in the algorithms, right? And those sorts of things, I think, are the transparency, the de-emphasizing, the crowding out bad stuff, with good content, which some of the platforms are trying to do. They say there's not enough good content, so it's one of the items for our Justice Defense Corps. Build more good content to drown out the misinformation out there about the justice system, right? Those are operating within our area of strength. Use our open marketplace, our transparency to our favor. And I like that better than an emphasis on takedown, for example, of hate speech. I think there you're starting to get into really, really tricky territory. Outright incitement to violence, advocacy for violence, I think is a much easier call. But these are tricky times. And a lot of it is domestic voices. Yeah.
Yeah, my question is about the role of state governments in confronting this issue. I know that the Mueller report mentioned that several states, had cyber attacks conducted against them to secure things like voter rolls. I think I believe Illinois and some other states, we believe those operations were successful to secure that information so that they could then micro-target these operations. Do you believe that states are moving fast enough to kind of secure their election infrastructure? Do you believe that we've made progress on that issue?
We've definitely made progress, and some states are moving faster. Some states are moving, right? And it's really problematic. But DHS has really continued the fight and has worked hard to build relationships. When we first started dealing with the secretaries of state, I readily admit, we were too late in the game. We didn't really start we had some early conversations with the leadership, but we didn't really get all the secretaries of state on the phone with Secretary Johnson at DHS until well into the summer. And they were totally stressed at that, right? I mean, they have a list a mile long. They start well over a year out getting ready for these elections. We didn't fully explain to them what it meant to be designated as critical infrastructure. They saw it as a federal takeover of their elections. We didn't get off on the best foot, and I readily admit that. DHS has brought in folks that the states trust, and they have developed those relationships. They're providing a lot of assistance to the states. There's a multi-state information sharing and analysis center, which has really stepped up. It's been in existence for a long time. So there's a lot of good things going on. They're getting clearances for people at the state level. We're figuring out who needs to actually get the information within that bureaucracy of each of the states. So we're making a lot of good progress. We still have a long way to go. And most importantly, I think, is the ability for post-election audits to reassure the public. I mean, right now in a lot of states, somebody doesn't even have to hack into the voting. They just have to claim they did it. Just claim you hacked in and you changed a bunch of votes. And in a lot of states, they have no way to disprove it. Yes. Yeah.
I wonder if you haven't taken a too narrow review of what the problem is, in that we are in effect creating our own vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about that in the area of news. If I went on and looked, whether I looked left or right, I would be hard pressed to differentiate the fake news that you presented from the Russians with the current cable news networks that present a one-sided view, either left or right, of everything. And give the world an opportunity, or our enemies an opportunity, to take that and run with it. I wonder if there is something that we ought to be doing to improve and deal with this kind of polarization that currently not only exists, but continues to increase. And for example, when the dean of the Columbia Journalism School was here, we asked him a question about how do they teach journalists, and how do they differentiate between news and opinion? And he said, well, we have a very sharp distinction between news and opinion. But there is none when you go into the media. So how do we deal with that? How do we educate our own people to be able to understand these very nuanced type of threats that are coming at us all the time?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I think it's a very good point. I do think there's a big difference between the kinds of outright lies and really misleading, information that fills Russian propaganda, and the sort of partisanship that we see, manifesting itself on daily on cable news networks, right? And when and not that they always get it right, but when they get it wrong, when they put out something that is factually inaccurate, they're pretty good about coming out later and saying, look, we got this wrong. So I think it's a false equivalency. Having said that, there is no question that the days of the country rallying around a Walter Cronkite and believing everything he says and on no matter what your political views might have been are really pretty much gone. I'm not in government anymore, so I can put in plugs. I actually kind of like Lester Holt, but I see this on the cable news, every day. I'm still watching too much of it. I try to limit my intake, but they're very emotional, and I sort of get that. I understand, particularly the CNN and the MSNBCs, why they are so emotional. For example, about this president who attacks them every day. But they are journalists, or at least they call themselves journalists. And there are certainly plenty of times when I wish they would hold that in check a little bit more. And I don't think it helps Americans. I do think that print media is better. But even there, I think journalists need to be honest about, and many of them are. A lot of the journalists understand that there is almost no way to make word choices without your subjective views coming into play on how you characterize them, what the word choices that you use, for example. And I think we just need to be honest about that. And that's part of teaching media literacy, right? I judged a hackathon up at Harvard, a bunch of Harvard students up at Harvard Law School. No, Harvard, not the law school. To get their ideas how to deal with disinformation online, generally speaking. And one of the group of kids had a very interesting idea where they built an algorithm that would quickly search online media and print media primarily, what we used to call print media. And they would be able to analyze very quickly whether it was mostly news or mostly analysis/opinion. And would be able to tell the reader who had this tool on their system, this piece is mostly news, or this piece is mostly analysis or opinion. It tends to lean, based on the word choices, etc., this piece leans somewhat left or leans somewhat right. And if you would like to read the same story about the same news from a different perspective, here's a link to a story that comes at it from a different perspective. I thought, that is so cool, that is brilliant. And of course, all my fellow judges completely mixed it because they thought nobody would be interested, nobody would use the tool.
Trust her will fund that.
Yes.
Recently at a Time Forum, Jared Kushner, senior advisor to the president, said that all this interference amounted to a couple of ads in Facebook. So when the White House itself is not involved in terms of really pushing the defense side. How do the professionals handle it? It reminds you of going on a date and she doesn't want to be with you. It is pretty tough. And so, you know, order to require a mandate from the White House said we need to put this as a prime problem, and we'd be talking a different tune. So how do the professionals continue doing what they're doing without just giving it up?
First of all, I think they are continuing to do what they're doing in each of the departments and agencies. I think the leadership at the department and agency level generally supports those efforts. And so that's the most important thing to them, you know, to those individuals in the trenches, is that they have support from their department or agency leadership. But it is, they try to keep below the radar screen. So I will share a story that I haven't told in public before. When I was at a big conference, I guess now maybe at least a year and a half ago, and in the hallway, I saw some friends of mine, and they introduced me to someone who was there from a federal agency that I will not name, who was kind of quietly handing out, sort of surreptitiously, cards that were an invitation to come to a meeting at a hotel across town. That this individual who was involved in a foreign influence task force was trying to pull some people together outside of Washington. This was in San Francisco. Silicon Valley types and others to talk about, you know, their views and get their ideas, but has to be very quiet. But we are in big trouble. We are in big trouble. It is a big problem because each department and agency can do what, you know, their thing, and they're all, and I do believe that they are doing the best they can. No one has been assigned to the mission to lead a whole-of-nation effort, which is what's required here, to counter foreign adversary influence, targeting the American population. The intelligence community can't do that. The Defense Department can't do that. The State Department can't do that. The FBI has a very important counterintelligence mission, but it's, you know, not our best foot forward in talking to the platforms, talking to the tech companies, right? DHS is doing the best it can, but it has not been assigned the mission. And we have a government that operates under enumerated powers, right? Unlike a lot of countries, it's not that the government can do whatever it wants to do, whatever it thinks is a good idea, unless it's prohibited from doing it. No, government has to have explicit authority to do what it's going to do. And departments and agencies generally need to have specific authorization to stand up a new program. And they need funding, and they need to be tagged with that mission. And no one's been tagged with that mission. And then, as I said earlier, the inability to really effectively come together in the interagency. The reports are that Secretary Nielsen tried and did convene some interagency meetings, but Secretary of Homeland Security is not going to be able to tell FBI, the intelligence community, you know, you guys do this and we'll do this, and that's what the White House has to do.
So has it ever happened in our history that the restraints and the constraints that have been placed on the intelligence community and those that keep us safe have been as bad as they are at this time? Where there's, I would say, a deliberate attempt not to push it because the concern would be that the president won because of Russia's assistance. That's what I understand. And so the question, there are very bright people in Congress. Why do they not step up and say, the Lindsey Grahams of the world and so on, and say, it's time for us to protect ourselves, because we're not.
Yeah.
And we sit and talk and dissect it, but in the end, there is no leadership. And so, you know, Caligula pointed his horse. And I don't see why, you talk to these people at the various levels, they could be fired tomorrow and non-professionals could be brought in, and then what?
Yeah. Yep. No, it's true. I think I don't think we have the answer, and I don't know that we ever will have the answer, whether Russia successfully changed the outcome of the election. I think until we get our heads around the possibility that they might have, which is all we'll ever know, we will not take this threat seriously enough, even in the public. Because the sense is, election, well, I've thought about this a lot. I think election interference gets the attention it gets, in part because there's a partisan advantage to pushing this narrative, frankly. And in part because there's a certain moral outrage that we can summon about a country coming in and even going so far as to hack in to our election infrastructure, right? But coming in and really with disinformation affecting the outcome, trying to affect the outcome of our election. Now, I do get that question, moral equivalency. Don't we do the same thing in other countries around the world? And I will tell you that while we have a sometimes I would even say sordid history, but at least a sometimes history of interfering, even in democracies and democratic elections around the world, that in my career, 30 plus years, that I have not seen that we do support human rights activists. We do try to make sure that that voices that want to be heard in societies are allowed to be heard. We are openly engaged in democracy promotion through overt organizations. So yes, countries like Russia view that as interference, but it is not the same. But I think because we can't quite get our heads around the fact that they might have actually done something as fundamental as change the outcome of an election without knowing whether they did or they didn't, it's hard for us to take seriously a more gradual erosion that could take place, that they could cause to be accelerated, of mistrust in our democratic institutions that fundamentally challenges our ability to operate in a cohesive way, to get behind national decisions about things we need to do as a country to protect our interests. Yeah.
Well, it seems to me that the Russians couldn't have a better situation right now than a leader who feels the press, free press is an enemy, who criticizes our allies that are basic to protecting and defending democracy worldwide. But that leads to another question. You say we need interagency cooperation. If we had a different kind of president who took some of this seriously, would that be a big step forward?
Yes.
So, you, I think.
Or if we could change this president's mind.
So you've been, I think, a little bit kind to, journalists and media saying that they generally get it right, try to correct when they get things wrong. I've noticed a lot of times, I will speak for specifically the local news in my town, they're susceptible to these disinformation campaigns. They will just go and report a trending hashtag.
Yes.
As though of course it's organic. I mean, you see trending hashtags on mainstream media.
Yeah.
Do you think maybe social media literacy is something that journalists maybe?
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, I was just at another conference. One of the delights of being out of government is I can go to the conferences for more than just my speaking time, actually be there. That was designed specifically to bring in journalists, particularly young journalists, to talk with them about the threat of disinformation and how it's done and what it means and how not to fall for these sorts of things. And that you asked about, I didn't get to the second part of your question, which was about Saudi Arabia and Iran. The Russiagate hoax, just in the last few days that NBC News was reporting on, was a relatively unsophisticated kind of automated activity pushing this hashtag Russiagate hoax. But it was, they think, really just designed to create a trending hashtag. They didn't care whether anybody really even read their tweets. They were all using the exact same sentence, but they were all including hashtag Russiagate hoax. And so they were trying to put out as many of these as they could in an automated way to make it appear as though this is trending. And why do they do that? Because if people think that something is fringy out here and only a few people believe it, they're less likely, right, to believe it, to read it. But if it appears to be, almost mainstream, and that's what they are doing. They're taking these fringe ideas a lot of times, and they are moving them through the power of their, in the Russians' case, sophisticated use of social media and affinity groups, and making it a trending hashtag and making it appear more mainstream than it is. And yes, the media has gotten lazy. Think about all the stories you read where they sort of introduce this, and I saw this on RT today. RT especially, but mainstream media in the United States is the same thing. a little introduction, and then it's all just reprinting tweets. You know, this is happening online, and here's this tweet and this tweet, and they're not even verified, they're just tweets. And so, yes, the media, and I think there is a fair amount of soul searching going on there. At least, certainly, I think I see it in the print media folks. Now, I'm dealing with reporters from, you know, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, you know, sort of mainstream papers. But I think they are. Part of the problem is the state of journalism in this country. Much bigger issue, right? So these local newspapers, they have no staffs, they have very little funding. It's a wonder they still exist. They're mostly an online presence, and so they are going to be susceptible to these things. And we absolutely need to focus on it. Yes.
I'm curious about your take on the executive order that came out last September on sort of creating procedures for dealing with foreign interference in elections and potentially imposing sanctions for them. What is your take on that executive order, and have you seen any action since?
So the executive order did designate, thank you for bringing that up, did designate FBI has the lead on the counterintelligence aspects of foreign influence. And as a result of that, they are now looked at as they have the lead on countering foreign influence. But as I said, I don't think they're really positioned to lead a whole nation effort, but it's at least something. And we did get an executive order, and it did say, you know, and it did call for sanctions, which have not yet been imposed, is my understanding. So somehow, they got this executive order through the process. You know, maybe kind of under the radar screen, maybe saying, hey, there's a lot of pressure out there to look like we're doing something. But it's not clear how meaningful it's been.
Last question.
Okay.
Thinking the unthinkable beyond just trying to change the mind of the president. What would happen if the 2020 election were actually very contentious with clear signs of action?
Well, I'll tell you what I worry about. I do worry about that. I think it's a problem, and I think a lot of people are, this is one of the reasons that so many of us are pushing so hard for states to have auditable, you know, trails post-election, ability to do post-election audits. But I am very worried that losing candidates or the losing candidate, a losing candidate, will just claim that the whole process was rigged, right? And claim that, you know, there were problems, that the outcome is illegitimate. And I think it's important for bipartisan thinking right now about, you know, who can stand up at such a time and say to the American public, here's all the things that were in place to make sure we had a fair, legitimate system. Here's all the things that are going to be happening now to go back and audit and clarify this. You know, let's not make assumptions and sort of turn down the temperature. I'm quite concerned about the level of emotion and rhetoric that we've seen already, and where that will go as we get closer and closer, and then post-election.